Would you obey an authority figure, even if it meant hurting someone? Most people say no, but one experiment proved otherwise. Ordinary people kept going, even when they felt uncomfortable. They hesitated, they protested, but they still obeyed. Not because they were evil, not because they wanted to, but because they were told to continue. This is the experiment that exposed human obedience. At first, the experiment looked simple. 3 people entered the room: a scientist, a participant, and another man who seemed like a volunteer. The participant was told this was a memory test, but that was not the real experiment. The real experiment was much darker. The participant became the teacher. The other man became the learner. The teacher's job was simple: read questions, wait for answers, and every time the learner gave a wrong answer, press a button. But this was not an ordinary button. The teacher was told that the button would send an electric shock to the learner, and with every wrong answer, the shock level would increase. At first, the shock seemed small, nothing too serious. The participant was nervous, but still continued. Then the learner started reacting. He complained. He sounded scared. He asked to stop. And suddenly, the experiment no longer felt harmless. The participant looked uncomfortable. He began to doubt himself. He looked at the scientist and asked if they should stop. But the scientist stayed calm. No anger, no shouting, no threats. Just a calm voice saying, "Please continue." And that was the moment the real test began. Because the experiment was not testing memory. It was testing obedience. How far would a normal person go? If an authority figure told them to keep going, the learner kept reacting. Then suddenly, he went silent. No answer, no voice, nothing. Imagine being the participant in that room. You press the button. Someone reacts in pain. You press again. They complain. You press again. They ask to stop. And then, silence. At that point, many people would assume something terrible had happened. The participant looked terrified. He did not want responsibility. He did not want to hurt anyone. But the scientist still told him to continue. And here is the disturbing part. Most people did not stop early. In the original study, many participants continued all the way to the highest level. Not because they were enjoying it, not because they were cruel, but because the pressure of authority was stronger than they expected. That is what made the experiment so disturbing. It did not reveal monsters. It revealed ordinary people. People who were nervous, people who were sweating, people who questioned what they were doing, but still continued because someone in a lab coat told them the experiment had to go on. And that is where the experiment becomes uncomfortable, because it forces a question most people avoid. Are we as independent as we think? We like to believe we make our own choices. We like to believe we would always do the right thing. We imagine that if something felt wrong, we would stand up, we would say no, we would walk away. But in real life, obedience is powerful. Authority changes how people think. A uniform changes how people react. A title changes how people listen. A calm command can feel stronger than a loud warning. And in that room, the participant was not just pressing a button. He was fighting something inside his own mind. One part of him said, "Stop, this feels wrong." The other part said, "The scientist knows better. The experiment must continue. I am not responsible. I am just following instructions." And that sentence is one of the most dangerous sentences in human history. Because when people believe responsibility belongs to someone else, they can do things they never imagined doing. The participant did not feel like the one in control. The scientist was giving the orders. The machine was delivering the shocks. The experiment was creating the rules. So the participant's mind found a way to step back, to say, "This is not fully my fault." And once that happens, obedience becomes easier. The scary part is that the authority figure did not need to be violent. He did not need to force anyone. He simply stood there, calm, serious, confident, and that confidence made people obey. This is why the experiment became famous, because it showed that evil does not always begin with hatred. Sometimes it begins with pressure, with politeness, with rules, with hierarchy, with someone saying, "Keep going," and someone else thinking, "Maybe I have no choice." But here is something important. The shocks were not real. The learner was not actually being harmed.
The learner was part of the experiment. The real subject was the teacher, the person pressing the button. The participant did not know this. To him, it felt real. The screams felt real. The silence felt real. The responsibility felt real. And that is why the results were so shocking, because the experiment showed how far people might go when they believe authority has taken control of the situation. But the story is not as simple as saying, humans are bad. That would be too easy. The real lesson is more complicated. People obey for many reasons. They obey because they trust experts. They obey because they do not want to cause trouble. They obey because they feel trapped. They obey because everyone expects them to continue. They obey because stopping feels like disobeying the system. And humans are social creatures. We are trained from childhood to follow rules. Listen to parents. Listen to teachers. Listen to police. Listen to doctors. Listen to bosses. Most of the time, this helps society function. But the same instinct that keeps order can also become dangerous. Because if authority gives a harmful order, the brain may still want to obey, not because the person agrees, but because obedience feels safer than resistance. Resistance is uncomfortable. Saying no creates conflict. Standing
up can make you feel alone. And in the experiment, the participant was alone. The scientist was confident. The room felt official. The machine looked scientific. The process seemed important. Everything around the participant told him, this is normal. This is allowed. This must continue. And that is how the situation became stronger than the person. This is why the experiment still matters today. Because obedience does not only happen in laboratories, it happens in workplaces, in schools, in governments, in groups, online, in families, in any place where one person has power and another person feels pressured to comply. Sometimes people do things they feel unsure about because a boss said so. Sometimes people stay silent because everyone else is silent. Sometimes people follow a crowd even when their conscience tells them something is wrong. And sometimes the most dangerous question is not, would I do something evil? The real question is, would I notice the moment I started obeying something wrong? Because obedience rarely feels evil at first. It feels normal. It feels responsible. It feels like doing your job. It feels like following the rules. And that is exactly what makes it powerful. The experiment does not mean everyone obeys. Some people did stop. Some people refused. Some people listened to their conscience. And that matters because it shows that resistance is possible. But resistance takes awareness. It takes courage. It takes the ability to pause and ask, who is responsible here? What am I actually doing? And if this feels wrong, why am I still continuing? That pause can change everything. Because authority works best when people stop questioning, when they move automatically, when they let someone else think for them. But the moment a person stops and says, no, I am still responsible, the spell begins to break. That is the real lesson of the obedience experiment. Not that humans are hopeless, not that everyone is cruel, but that ordinary people can be pushed further than they expect, when authority, pressure, and responsibility all mix together. And that means we should be careful. Careful with power, careful with orders, careful with systems, careful with the phrase, I was just doing what I was told. Because history has shown us something terrifying. Most harm is not done by people who wake up wanting to be evil. Sometimes it is done by people who stop asking questions, people who follow the chain, people who trust the system, people who believe the responsibility belongs to someone above them. And that is why this experiment still feels disturbing decades later. It does not point at monsters. It points at normal people. People like the ones you see every day. People like us. And maybe that is the hardest part to accept, because everyone wants to believe they would be different. Everyone wants to believe they would refuse. Everyone wants to believe they would walk away. But the experiment asks one uncomfortable question. If you were in that room, with the scientist standing beside you, with the machine in front of you, with the pressure building, what would you actually do? Would you stop or would you obey?